This is part one of the emergence of Latin American democracy. You know, in the 1980s and 90s, there was a very positive development throughout Latin America, and that was that military regimes were leaving power and civilian regimes were coming up, and those civilian regimes started to become more and more democratic. But the really big question was, is this a re-democratization, or is this really the first time we have democracy in the region? Now, we know that in Chile, because of its unique history in the 19th century, the 20th century, there were open competitive elections, and left-wing groups had power, right-wing groups had power, centrist groups had power. And Costa Rica, beginning in the late 1940s, also developed a democracy. But throughout most of the region, there were civilian governments that existed, with very few people participating in choosing them. So it wasn't really democracy. So what do we mean when we say democracy? Well, first of all, it's the broad popular participation in open and competitive elections. So when we say competitive elections, what we mean is that, there are real choices, and that many of the choices have a legitimate shot at winning an election. That voters are not impeded from voting. There's a broad franchise. Most people, everyone after a certain age should be able to vote. But they also don't face impediments of the absence of knowledge. That there's a free flow of information. You have a free press. You have a competitive, open electoral process, debates, etc., campaign advertising. And, it is something that people, have, access to and to make real choices. And what we see in Latin America, and why it's such a positive development in the 1980s and 90s into the 21st century, is that the new social movements provided a lot of the social and political vocabularies of democracies. A democratic ethos, an ideal, came from people's view of things in liberation theology and the women's movement and the new unions that were outside the state and other groups, environmentalists and so forth. All of these groups fought very hard to expand participation in the system. And here is the real innovation that maybe you think is controversial, but this became very, very much a part of the narrative in Latin America. They said, we have to be able to measure democracy by outcomes. What do they mean by that? They're saying, look, if it's real democracy and there are real choices and everyone gets to participate, then how on earth would a country where, 90% of the people are seen as being poor, how would those 90% of the people vote to keep in power someone, who was going to do nothing about their poverty, who was only going to look after the interests of the elites? So, the ends mattered. And by looking at the outcomes, we can see if this democracy is truly promoting social justice. And the belief is that the majority of people in Latin America think the government should promote social justice. So if it's not, then it's not a truly democratic government. Now, you have to understand that all of this comes out of the military dictatorships of the 60s and 70s. And there were important openings that took place in the 1970s and early 80s. Now, Mexico, as I've said several times, was dominated by the PRI government, and there was no democracy. I mean, there's some competitive elections now, but basically two elite parties from the center-right and the right have traded back and forth. Cuba is still controlled by Castro. And in the early 1980s, there are very few examples in Latin America of open government. Now, what's ironic is that now, in the 21st century, Mexico and Cuba still are not terribly democratic, but almost every place else is. But all of Latin America, and if you go back to the discussion on neoliberalism, all of Latin America faced similar economic circumstances. That the oil crisis of the early 1970s that led to the debt crisis of the 1970s and 80s, increased inflation, hurt the standard of living, put these authoritarian governments on the spot, because their whole point was like, we're here to solve all the problems, but the problems just seemed to be getting worse and worse and worse. And then at the same time, you had a U.S. president from 1977 to 81, Jimmy Carter, who began to push for human rights. And he was very critical of the violations of human rights that he saw from dictatorships. And he and the United States government became major proponents for increased democracy. Now, that really matters, right? Because the United States had either tacitly or quite actively supported these military coups. And now the United States is saying quite the opposite. Moreover, you have these new actors. And this just becomes so important that the liberation theologians and the new local churches, the ecclesiastical-based communities, they weren't tied to communists and populists. They weren't tied to the old elite church. And this was true of New Labor. New Labor was free of the taint of the old ways of doing things. Feminist and environmental groups, obviously, were just completely different. These groups were ideal for surviving in a dictatorship because they weren't hierarchical. They didn't take orders from the outside. You could arrest or torture some of the people involved, and there were plenty of other people because of their unique structures. They were hard to defeat. They were also hard to demonize. One of the most important groups in Argentina was a group called the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo. These women organized because the Argentine dictatorship was so violent and was involved in such torture, and it would literally just scoop people off the street and torture and murder them. And it was so bad that we now have this narrative of to have been disappeared. People were disappeared. And the Argentine military would literally, get someone who was involved in guerrilla activities, get that person's address book, and then arrest everyone in the address book and murder many of them. And suddenly, this became a deeper and deeper crisis. And the mothers of these children started protesting in the main central square in Buenos Aires, the capital, demanding to know what had happened to their children. And the military at first kind of brushed them off and called them las locas, the crazy women. But they were increasingly effective in calling attention to regime atrocities. And, it's very hard for a conservative military government to be openly against motherhood. And that's what they were doing. And so these women who, again, were not part of a formal political movement, were extraordinarily effective in challenging the status quo. We've talked several times about the new unionism, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva. There he is in 1979 leading a strike. And we know from the lecture on neoliberalism that, he becomes the president of Brazil in 2003. So essentially, what's going on here is that in the context of weakening dictatorships, in the context of economic crisis, in the context of the United States, at least through 1981, of being very much against these dictatorships, we have the new social movements moving from the fringes to the center. While Las Madres were called, the crazy ones, the crazy women, they were incredibly effective. They really, they were hard to, whether the police going to, in front of television cameras and journalists and the public, arrest a bunch of mothers demanding to know where their children and grandchildren were. And the Workers' Party was seen as a fringe movement, but the auto industry loved working with them. And they ended up electing the current president. Actually, that slide is wrong. They elected the previous president and the current president. So the current president and her predecessor. But groups used new forms of organization to press for a democratic opening, to say, look, we want an open society, but we don't want just the old pre-dictatorship ways of doing things. And, they were successful because lots of things were coalescing around the idea that Latin America needed change. The militaries, particularly the Brazilian military, to some extent the Chilean military, were really exhausted. The Argentine military, we'll talk in a little bit, kind of ruins its own rule. The new social movements have staying power. They weren't seen as radical or disruptive. In fact, they were increasingly seen as the future of Latin American politics. So if you just think where you are in, say, the early 1980s, you've got these corrupt, tired military regimes who've been involved in torture and all sorts of financial manipulation and corruption. They have high debts, high inflation. There's no freedom. And then you've got these new groups who talk about what? Democracy, accountability. They're not talking about radical revolution or radical reform or change. And in the case of labor, perhaps where you would find the furthest left-wing groups, what are they talking about? They're talking about getting better wages as they work for big foreign auto companies. They're not talking about taking over auto companies. And their biggest allies are the Catholic Church, certainly not a pillar of revolution. So by the early 1980s, Latin America really looks, with the exception again of Cuba and Mexico, like it's on the verge of democracy.